labels represents an action step, something that's going to, something that we believe is going to pull our current reality closer to whatever our desired state is. And that each, and this one has the word intervention written in it, because that came up. And this little guy is, like in special ed world, this would be the response to intervention model. And things that were talked about were like having a mandatory study hall. There was a lot of talk about doing things specifically for 9th and 10th graders, and with emphasis on 9th grade. And so the word opportunity came up because that's an old school term for a structure for meeting the needs of a certain group of 9th and 10th graders. APEX, an online curriculum as a credit recovery program for 12th and 11th graders. A lunchtime study hall for kids that have 2 or more Fs. It's going to be interesting to see what that looks like, especially with our 9th graders after we get our grades in and are able to disaggregate that information. In terms of form, if the function is high levels of learning for all kids, one of the forms that was talked about was that maybe we need less of this and maybe we need more heterogeneity. More, because one of the comments that was made by a teacher who teaches honors kids is that we have kids that are in honors classes, but they're not really honors kids. I mean, there's a handful of kids in an AP class or in an honors class that the feeling was that really would meet whatever the criteria is to be a part of an honors program. And that, well, I'll leave it at that. That was what I was talking about. Small groups, and that's where houses came from. That's a word that I employed, but it was about possibly isolating 9th graders and giving them a special identity and a place, and as a freshman focus, a wing, but then breaking it into smaller houses. There was also talk about possibly looping so that you get acquainted with kids, like AVID teachers are with kids for 2 years, so that a math teacher and English teacher might be, or a 9th grade house would stay together. Maybe there would be 3 or 4 teachers that would move with kids to the next grade level. We also talked about the possibility of a K-12 configuration on the campus. Some conversation around interdisciplinary, which would get to the project-based side, somewhere up here, project-based up top. How could we integrate AVID tenets in all of our courses, where everyone, and I guess there's history with that somewhere in the back of being, and maybe this is a bad word, but avidized was a term that was used. Every kid having an advocate, so that, a staff advocate, so maybe each staff member would have X number of students that would be that they'd advocate for. Frosh Focus, Through Different Eyes is a CD to watch, a DVD to watch. So when we got up here and we're talking about motivation and authentic engagement and about giving kids choices in around whatever our discipline is, but giving them a greater voice in what it is that they would want to, that their interests would be centered around, kind of like the environmentors with a project-based approach, and that real choice centered around passion, whatever they're passionate about, like those kids were talking about the environment. Recognizing that it's going to be fluid, that passion changes. And for a 9th grader, it could be day to day, period to period, month to month. It'll be flexible and anticipate undulation over the course of a 4-year period of time. There was also a lot of synergy around the word passion and whole school innovation. That it can't be everybody doing their own thing, that it has to be, there has to be a sense of collaboration with accountability to scale as a group. Kind of like tardy schools. So then it radiated out that passion and projects to having something specific that freshmen would produce, sophomores would produce, juniors would produce, that'd be a senior project, possibly. It's not, when I say this, obviously none of this is etched in anything other than an erasable whiteboard. The programmatic goals, possibly freshman exploration, and there was some talk about that being maybe a naughty word. Sophomores, that there would be greater specificity if we're doing exploration, then we would narrow down and narrow down more in the junior year, and then make a decision as seniors what this project might be. And we talked about Avid school-wide mentors, where all kids would be touched by Avid, all kids would have mentors, all kids would have an internship where they'd be out taking whatever they're passionate about and using it in a real-world setting, so that there wouldn't just be an emphasis on the academic side, but applying the academics to the relevancy of these to real world. The need for a college and career center on campus. And that's probably I touched almost everything that's up there. Inside here with the action steps, because we talked about the single school plan for student achievement, which from what I've been led to believe hasn't had a lot of value or validity on our campus, that needs to become real, and that each one of these action steps, there would be an ongoing process, and the process would be, okay, so we plan something based upon a perceived critical finding, an issue, a problem, a cause and a problem, that then we look for a research-based response to that issue, that critical finding, that we would then do it, and as we were doing it, we would study it, and then we would act on the data, either that we're going to keep doing it, stop doing it, or start something different because it's not being effective. So each one of these steps would have an ongoing accountability piece built into it. That's everything we talked about yesterday.
About 2 hours or so, right?
2.5, yeah, 5:20.
You got to hear it, yeah, almost 5:30.
Well,
So what is the 80-20
I was hoping you'd ask. Okay, so this was something, when I was exposed to this expectancy theory, and this is a simplified version of an expectancy theory, the same guy that was talking about this, talked about this. And it was fascinating for me, listening to this, because it just made sense for me. And so, what this guy was saying is that if you were to go into, say, the algebra standards, and if you were looking at what you want kids absolutely to know at the end of the school year, and then you had another filter or another set of lenses where you asked yourself, in algebra, this kid has to remember this for the rest of their life. Okay, really? I don't use algebra very much these days, nor have I ever in my adult life. But there are certain things as a mathematician that you would want them to know for the end of the school year and possibly for the rest of their life, and that you know is going to be a prerequisite skill for the next level or maybe the following level at Algebra 2. He would argue that if you were to take all of the algebra standards and if you really compress them into those areas that you want them to know no matter what at the end of the year or the rest of their life, it might be 30% of all the standards that are listed on the framework for algebra, in the framework for algebra. He would argue that the first unit that you teach in algebra, that with those 30, he would argue 30% of the standards, you would base 80% of your test on that first unit on that 30%. Track? We're on the same page, mathematically? Okay. And then the other 20% of the test, they would have to figure out for themselves. There would be, you would explicitly teach the 30%, but it's on them to dig deeper, because we have kids that walk into our classrooms every day, not a lot, but they really don't need a whole lot of us. There are a handful of those kids. So we want, if they're going to get a high B or an A, they got to dig deep. Okay, so that's his 20%. Then with the next unit and every unit thereafter, he suggests the following. Okay, so at the end of Unit 1, I summarize everything that I want, the 30%. I summarize it, and I give it to them as a gift. And you put it in your binder. Next unit, the 30% in the next unit, 60% of the test, the assessment's going to be on that 30%, 20% you gotta figure out for yourself, and 20% is gonna be that one-page synopsis from Unit 1. Unit 3, 60% of the 30% in Unit 3, 20% you gotta dig yourself. The next 20% is the unit summary from 1 and 2. And they keep that all year long, knowing that I'm gonna hold you accountable for 20% of that, and 20% of the 30%, because you don't bring the 20% forward, you bring the 30% that you want to know by the end of the year and the rest of their life. And so that was just, for me, kind of a cool thing, because these 4 essential questions, what do we want kids to know and be able to do, ties to this. And as a teacher, I mean, if I feel comfortable, if I really trust the bald-headed guy that is saying that this is okay to do, and you feel a boxcar being, released, or maybe multiple cars, where, okay, really, I can focus on that, and nobody's going to come and get me, and nobody's going to come and get us. I mean, I could have Glenn Thompson here, and he would say nobody's going to come and get us. I mean, even if our test scores were to go in the tank, but my belief is that if we were to do this, our test scores won't go in the tank. Kids will become proficient at those really critical things that we know are valuable, that they're going to need at the end of the year for the assessment as a prerequisite for the next course, and also for the rest of their life.
Kind of just final thing.
Yep. All righty. Thank you, guys.